Shalom, Boker Tov, no, no, no. Soraim Tovim, Achar Soraim Tovim. Trying, was learning Hebrew, kind of. Anyway, this video is about the hypocrisy of modern atheism and the practical application of religion, which can be best observed in Israelis. Israelis are largely atheist, yet their claim to the land, right, ancient Judea, is religious. It's in the Tanakh, the Torah, as well as the Christian Bible. I don't think Islam really agrees, but Christianity agrees with Judaism that Israel is the Holy Land and the Jews are God's chosen people. So when the Jews returned to the Promised Land, that was a motivating factor in the Balfour Declaration of World War II, fulfillment of prophecy. Which prophecy is debatable because the dream of Dani Elohim, right, Daniel, is that Israel will inherit the entire globe, the entire earth, not just Judea. But I digress. Where to begin? Personally or existentially? I guess personally. So for me, I was born and raised Spanish Catholic in New Mexico. I'm Mondragon and Lovato, both conquistador families, Spanish conquistadors, which have been in that area since 1608. This video is going to get into a lot of layers of analysis, multiple levels of analysis about the same incidents, events, and topics. So the Spanish Catholics refused to sleep with the Native Americans in accordance with the law of Moses about not intermarrying with the heathen. So there's a lot of inbreeding. I get a hereditary high IQ from my father and schizophrenia from my mother. When I was in 5th grade, I had scored gifted and was eligible for grants into private school. Here's where you get into the non-theological scientific application. My dad, being corrupted by the drug and sex revolution, was very anti-church. So the plutocracy created this sort of anathemic and agonist-antagonist relationship between certain behaviors that were associated with religion, specifically the church. Therefore, so over here you have monogamy, sobriety, sexual morality, only sex within procreative, reproductive, marriage purposes, lifelong parenting, two-parent household, nuclear family, etc. So to fight the church, you had orgies, multiple sexual partners, etc. So my dad was not like his father. His father worked really hard to make sure his kids had a roof over their head. When Taos was a poor little Mexican town, so he, raised sheep, survived droughts that lasted up to 10 years. Worked really hard to maintain irrigation ditches and cisterns and things like that. This is at a time when you were lucky. You'd have 14 kids, and you'd be lucky if 7 of them made it to adulthood to reproduce and continue your line. Thus, as many copies of your gene pass on to the next generation. My dad got his degree in philosophy, so he was unable to feed and house himself, let alone me. When you have a child, and you're going to be a father, you choose a degree with no guarantee of income. That already is a boomer thing, right? Screw the future. Who cares about the kids? So my brother forced marijuana on me that summer. Even though I was eligible for grants in a private school, that was my one way out of poverty at that time. This video might be offensive, but I find that objective analysis requires emotional detachment. So you can call it a political bias, either direction, racist, sexist, homophobic. I only care that it's factual and objective. I don't want to succumb to the fundamental attribution error where you falsely attribute causality where it does not exist out of any bias, political, racial, otherwise. We had the family history of schizophrenia that my mother lied to me about through omission. She kept that hidden from us that her mother, my grandmother, was in the mental home. Marijuana activates and exacerbates schizophrenia, and my understanding is schizophrenia is a gene mutation caused by inbreeding. It's a heterozygotic gene mutation, which means it can be eliminated with diligence on controlling who reproduces and who doesn't. Basically, applied eugenics by differential fertility rates, not differential mortality rates. One of the broken promises of the sex revolution was contraceptives would eliminate STDs and unplanned pregnancies, therefore abortions, yet those things increased with the introduction of contraceptives and the decline of the church. This reflects what happened later on about when I started learning psychology and applying science in the direction of isolating and identifying environmental stimulus that is contributing factors to maladaptive thoughts and behavior. And electrocuting myself for 3 amputations is maladaptive thoughts and behavior brought on by marijuana, activating my schizophrenia. So the marijuana culture, environmental stimulus, that is cultivated and reinforced with the rap industry, Hollywood, media, etc. So here's we'll just jump into the other stuff. We'll just jump back and forth between existential and personal. In this book, Jewish Eugenics by John Glad, very good book. I highly recommend it. It discusses Jews who were eugenicists, basically, and they weren't just nationalist socialists. For example, you had this Jewish socialist named Oda Oldberg who called it moral degeneracy by cultural conditioning. Now, this was a time when Magnus Hirschfeld, who was a eugenicist and one of the first proponents of transgenderism, was one of the people that were being opposed by the Nazis. The Nazis were burning his books on transgenderism, etc. So it's really interesting that people look at Jews and Nazis like these just vague, inaccurate overgeneralizations of ideologies, because there were many Jews who opposed Jews on sexual immorality, drug use, etc. She, in her book, Degeneracy by Cultural Conditioning, establishes that the Weimar period in Germany was socially engineered as a eugenics application, applied eugenics, that the genetically inferior would be naturally selected out of the gene pool by vices, thus legalizing drugs. Like now we have legalizing marijuana, but also pornography, etc. That this would increase the STDs to eliminate the genetically inferior, as well as drug overdoses would eliminate the genetically inferior, and so forth and so on. It was a population reduction method, a very effective one, in my opinion. It's working today. But jumping ahead of myself. So after my brother forced marijuana on me in the 5th grade, instead of getting into private school with those grants, I ended up homeless on drugs. My dad had the opportunity to take custody of me in that moment. He could not, because he couldn't afford to feed and house himself, let alone me. So he and my mom had a meeting after the school met with them to where he just signed my future away. He just threw my life away. They both knew that if I lived in the house with my other gang member brother, my mom had out of wedlock as a Catholic, this alcoholic Marine that was very physically abusive and an absentee father. They knew that that would just destroy my future. I have no chance at a future. And my dad said, "Oh well, screw him. Who gives a crap?" The Native American predisposition to alcoholism is due to intergenerational incest from being isolated in the Americas for so many generations, just like Aborigines in Australia, and so forth and so on. The pancreas and liver cannot secrete enzymes necessary to process and metabolize alcohol and sugar. This is where you get the hypocrisy of modern day atheists. They're very liberal, even though atheism is inherently apolitical, just like Christianity and Catholicism technically is supposed to be, etc. Yet, when you tell these proponents of science that there are inherent biological differences between race, just like there are between gender, they become very anti-science. And this is usually because they interpret it inaccurately, almost like their psychological views have been cultivated environmentally through with corporations as the architects behind this cultural atmosphere that shapes and molds the minds of the masses, thus using technology as a method of behavior modification for the masses. So it's always this white versus black thing, even though America is neither in Europe or Africa. Whites have the highest rates of skin cancer because translucent skin is a genetic adaptation to geographical regions, just like black skin, wider noses, thinner nostrils, altitude, etc. This is why Somalian immigrants in places like Michigan have a vitamin D deficiency. There are Filipino sea nomads who have adapted to the point they, on average, can hold their breath for 15 minutes. There are Thailand swimmers who have genetically adapted and evolved to have smaller pupils, which give them better eyesight underwater. These evolutions still occurring. The downturned nose is an advantage swimming in ice water, etc., etc., etc. So when I was in Seattle, this caused me to go atheist. I fell out of faith with the Catholic Church because they were incapable of preventing. Now it's marijuana dispensaries, but even then, when it was illegal, there was still marijuana, Snoop Dogg, all these Cheech and Chong, all these environmental stimulus that was deliberately corrosive to the moral structure of the country. Therefore, it's not destruction. Destruction is transformation. It's terraforming. They use these people. Plutocracy. America is a plutocracy disguised as a democracy. It is very much the wealthy and powerful governing the poor. Democracy is an illusion. But yeah, so this led me to homeless and on drugs most of my life instead of college, career, etc. And when I electrocuted myself, eventually I realized the many failures of state-provided mental health care, which is another failure of atheism, especially liberal atheism on the West Coast. The objective application of science would have been atheists observing that I clearly have schizophrenia and clearly marijuana is setting it off. Therefore, criminalizing it is the only thing that's reducing it. But they put greed over people. And it's also Darwinistic because, again, applied eugenics, right? So even though I had quit, it was constantly being pushed on me in my environment by marijuana users because they lack the mental capacity to maintain a boundary where they keep their addictions contained to themselves. Instead, they push on anyone and everyone around them that they can. Addicts always try to pull everyone down with them. This is one of the examples of the harmful impact it has on society. Like the vehicular fatalities doubling, even increasing in many states that have legalized suicides, homicides, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I began to realize that the atheist environment in the Puget Sound was not positively reinforcing of sobriety nor sexual morality. It is a hypersexualized hookup culture of drug abuse and addiction. Essentially, white people without Christianity are the same as pagans, right? So this eventually led to me coming out to red states like North Carolina because I once again fell for the agonist-antagonist relationship. The very same white atheist liberals who were holding the knife in my back destroyed my life by just refusing to acknowledge my mental illness, let alone get me help, or at the very least keep secondhand marijuana exposure from happening to me. We're pointing the finger, oh, Christians are the bad guys, Trump is the bad guy, white people are the bad guys, Republicans are the bad guys. And so I came out to North Carolina and other red states. And it's not like, the Democrats will be like, oh, well, these are red states. We're just going to leave them alone and let them be conservative. No, 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 no. They have to be totalitarian about it. They are, everything that's happening right now with politics is on the surface, they're disguising it as, altruistic for whatever label you can choose, transphobia, homophobia, racist, whatever. No, 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 no. Peel that mask back, and you see their true intentions is power and control and greed. For example, defunding the police has led to an increase in black on black homicides and black drug overdose deaths, yet the narrative was that the police are racist. Turns out racism is actually good for black people because it stops them from killing each other so much. Like, if you care about blacks, you want them to be more policed. South Africa, Zimbabwe, Haiti, Detroit, you name it, any black majority area can verify what I'm saying as factually accurate offline, no matter what hypocrisy and people on the internet say. And there's genetic factors involved in behavior. The I'll try to phrase this in a way that the morally and intellectually corrupt and degenerate American mind can understand. Because blacks have big dicks, they got small brains on average. There are some intelligent blacks, but they're not as much of the majority of blacks as, say, Asians, right? You're more likely to meet intelligent Asians than intelligent blacks. Their percentage of the population is significantly smaller and bigger, you know, consequently, as a result of genetics and environment. Epigenetics is the study of environment and genetics. This is why blacks are overrepresented in prison populations, but also athletics, not growing food. Globally, as well as in the United States, Africans are not the majority food producers. I think in the United States, 97% of our food production is white farmers. You, just like the kulaks, right? When you kill off the farmers, everybody starves. That's what happened in Zimbabwe. That's what happened in Haiti, etc. So there's this huge atheist ideology that is against reality and against science, that is trying to force reality to mold into a fantasy, where to me, objective, absent of religion, scientific analysis and application means that you adjust your opinions to fit reality, not the other way around. Oh, my leg's going to sleep. So it's interesting because the application of religion, if you look at America pre 1960s, right, the secularist revolution essentially, you still had sexual immorality and alcoholism and drug overdoses, etc., but they were much less. They were more infrequent. And this means that with epigenetics, right, with the religious cultural atmosphere of sexual chastity and morality, abstinence from drugs, abstinence from intoxication, addiction, etc., that it happens much less. Whereas when you eliminate religion as, a psychological behavior modification application, then those things increase because they're not environmentally, essentially punishment and reward, right? Positive reinforcement and negative reinforcement is still reinforcement because they're not being suppressed. They're being cultivated and increased artificially by the plutocracy, by the engineers of culture, the corporations, whatever you want to call it, 1%. So it makes no sense to me because when I realized that I could not find a environment that was positively reinforcing of sobriety and abstinence from drugs, etc., which was objectively scientifically true, that drugs increase bad things. They're inherent with capitalism. Anywhere you get a strong economy, you're going to get prostitution, pornography, drugs, alcoholism, etc. This has nothing to do with religion and everything to do with human nature outside of religion. So, America pre 1960s had a much lower divorce rate, much lower STD rates, and much lower drug overdose deaths, even when you adjust for population growth, because there was a much higher percentage of people who were religious, and actually their orthodoxy matched their orthopraxy. So it's interesting to me to watch atheists such as David Pakman and don't engage in all this blatant hypocrisy and blatant dishonesty while simultaneously claiming to be morally superior. Atheists say, I know I was one for 19 years. I still kind of am. Atheists will say that morality is rooted in mirror neurons, yet somehow there's no empathy for the victims of the drug industry or the sex industry or the demographic change and culture shifts, this terraforming of the American economy and culture. It has its victims. It has people who have been raped and murdered and brutally beaten and have their lives destroyed. No empathy for us, right? We're just the eggs you're breaking to make your omelet. No empathy for the families you destroyed, etc. So then, the first church that I went to was an Episcopalian church. They served alcoholic wine. I was sober 2 months, drank that alcohol. Did not know it. They didn't warn me, so that failed. And then I went sober. I went to the Methodist church. They had women pastors and were promoting LGBT pastors, but Methodists are on the decline in the United States and on the rise in Africa and Asia, who are not so progressive. There was a little war there. And every other church that I went to, they couldn't even maintain their behavior to match the commandments of their own doctrines. But this led me to really get to the root of Christianity, which is Judaism, Hebrew. To the point that I wanted to learn Hebrew, and I have practiced it a little bit. I bought, the Art Scroll Siddur Tanakh. Not even necessarily because I believe. I do go back and forth between believing, but because I want to read it in the original Hebrew. I mean, there's so much hidden stuff to it. That's beautiful metaphorical parables. Like, for example, Chadam, right? Chadam is Hebrew for the earth of the red clay. Chava is the mother of all life, or Eve. Cain, for Cain and Abel. Cain means envy in Hebrew. So envy killed. Abel means like temporary, like breathing, like breath, like in passing. So there's Abraham was originally Avram, of his father. Avram was exalted, so exalted father, and then he became Avroham, father of the exalted. His son Isaac, Sachak means laughter because Sharai laughed when the angel told her she was going to have a baby at 90, like that far after menopause. Yisrael Elohim. Elohim is plural. I think Judaism was polytheistic in origin. Israel means the fight or struggle against God, but can also mean God's fight or El's fight, El's struggle, or God's will. So this really made me want to convert, but Jews are not as open and welcoming as Christians. I hope that Hitler was right about the Jews, not in a negative way, but that they could form a state within a state, and therefore I could find my Shangri-La, my Mecca, my promised land, which is just a community, right? A general territory within the United States that's still moral and marijuana free. Specifically, no secondhand marijuana smoke, because secondhand marijuana smoke causes hallucinations, suicidal, homicidal thoughts, and voices in my head. Schizophrenia is not fun. It's not pleasant. Everyone I've told this to just does not care, including Jews. I've told this to rabbis and stuff, and they're just like, "It sucks to be you." Oh well. That led me to the Mormon church, crazily enough, because the Mormons actually have like the word of wisdom and the law of chastity and stuff. But the Mormons, just like the Catholics and the Christians, failed to aggressively implement the laws of their religions onto their communities and territories, etc. They keep pornography stores from opening up in their communities, just like the Catholics did in New Mexico. Spanish Catholics, same thing. Marijuana dealers and dispensaries, prostitutes, pimps, Instead of opposing it, the Catholics became their best customers. So I don't know what to think. Well, I know what to think, but I don't know what feasible solution there is. If I want to go the true atheist route, because right now there's two opposing ideological government structures. One is a theocracy, which is an Islamic theocracy. So that would at least get me in a place where if they maintain their tenets of their faith, which many of these countries do, then there's no alcohol and hopefully no marijuana. I'm sure it's still sneaking in, but much less because, the drug laws are actually enforced and the execution of homosexuals, right? So this is like I don't know. But I see that as a good thing personally, but this is my opinion. I know that could get me banned on YouTube, so please don't. Just let me express that one opinion and don't show at me, bro. But um, the other one is communism, like communist China, which is not really communist anymore the way it was in the 1960s. Stalin executed prostitutes. He saw it as a parasitic existence. Once the, what do they call those all the time? Socioeconomic factors eliminated. If you were still a prostitute, you got killed. China, on the other hand, rehabilitated them to become teachers and nurses and things like that. So that China's STD clinic, the last STD clinic, closed in 1962. Prostitution was essentially eliminated in China. I'm sure it still happened here or there, a tiny bit, but for the most part, right, it's a percentage reduction of like 90 to 95% at least. And then they realized that communism couldn't make it without the wealth generated by capitalism, so they reopened, liberalized basically the economy to capitalism. So now it's this hybrid, just like National Socialism was, right? Kind of between communism and capitalism. Yeah. My stomach. But then there's communist Cuba, which I'd rather not move to because of the weather, the humidity, etc. But if I could find a place to move, um, with these sort of laws implemented aggressively, like marijuana is still illegal in places like Indonesia and Malaysia, yet people grow it in their front porch. I have this vague understanding that the Muslim area of Indonesia has the lowest amount of drug use, but at the same time, like when the tsunami hit in, I think it was 2007, 2014, I can't remember, there was the Buddhists and the Muslims. And the Buddhists were drunk and high, despite Buddha having the Eightfold Path, which specifically prohibits the consumption of intoxicants. You're not supposed to smoke weed or drink alcohol if you're a Buddhist, or do any drugs for that matter. They couldn't adhere to the tenets of their faith because, white tourism, essentially Australian and European American tourism, the Buddhists were on the beach giving a concert with beers and bongs and marijuana paraphernalia on the tables when the tsunami hit them mid concert and took them out. The Muslims saw the water recede from the shoreline and took it to higher ground. I interpret that to mean the Muslims were sober and therefore their cognitive functions were not impaired by drugs and alcohol, and they were more intact. Their senses were more intact with their environment, and this neurosensory feedback saved their lives. And the only reason for that is their religion demands sobriety, and they actually did it. But then I've seen Muslim girls on TikTok, twerking and stuff. So clearly, not all the tenets are strictly adherents of the faith. But those are the only atheist. So communist atheism is honest about drugs like marijuana, whereas capitalist atheism is corrupted by greed. Is that the interpretation to take from this? Maybe you guys could tell me which. Is there any sort of group that I can sort of escape to essentially and find shelter in that does not allow, like a bubble that is marijuana free, that doesn't allow secondhand marijuana to penetrate, because that is forced drugging. And again, I'll have to put this crassly, because the corrupted and perverted American mind cannot comprehend things. Well, on average, when you put the fire to the weed, the chemical inside the plant goes into the smoke. Anyone who breathes in the smoke breathes in the chemical from the plant. For you intelligent ones, this is called the combustion method of chemical extraction. It therefore goes into the lungs, through the cilia, enters the heart, enters the bloodstream, and affects the brain and nervous system, hence psychoactive chemicals like THC. So there's no magic fairies that make it. So only the person lighting the fire gets the psychoactive effect, and anyone else who breathes in the smoke does not. The secondhand high has been confirmed in California, right? There's parents who smoke weed with their kids in the house, and people like me were saying, no, this is clearly unethical. And THC shows up in saliva swabs, and of course the bloodshot eyes, and the irritation of the surface of the eye and things like that. But for me, it's the positive symptom presentation of schizophrenia. So it makes no sense that if atheism is morally superior to religion, why aren't they actively and assertively and effectively opposing marijuana and the marijuana industry expansion, etc.? Instead of lying about it, common lies marijuana proponents say are things like the black market will die in legalization. But this isn't true. California is a perfect example of that. The black market has only thrived and increased in California and other states due to legalization. The other one is that it will reduce hard drug use. This is also not true. Colorado's methamphetamine overdose death rate has increased exponentially every year since legalization. Another one is that it raises money for public education. Colorado is another good example of that. It raised a ton of money that went into public schools, yet the dropout rate increased due to marijuana. And so did the illiteracy rate. The illiteracy rate in Colorado now, I think last time I checked, was 54% and rising, 57%. Whereas when legalization first occurred, it was like 32% or something, 39%. Every dropout is seen as a loss of potential income. So there's actually greater cost than profit to marijuana economically, not just suicides, homicides, etc. But it seems that even religion can be corrupted. So it's all human nature. Help. Tell me where I can go or what I can do that move me to a place where, you know, marijuana isn't being smoked and isn't allowed to be smoked.